Hey guys, welcome for another discussion. We have an expert. His name is Dr. Matthew Nagra, and he's going to talk about plant based nutrition. And we're going to go over a bunch of details, diving into all kinds of health outcomes with vegans and nutrition advice, things like that. So, welcome in, Matt. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Good, good. Yeah, so tell us about your credentials first, familiarize yourself with the audience, and then we'll get into the talk.
Yeah, so I'm a naturopathic doctor. I practice out in Vancouver, BC. Prior to that, I studied microbiology at the University of Victoria, where I also studied some nutrition. My major was in microbiology, but I just enjoyed nutrition, so I did take some of those electives as well. And then beyond that, I've done a lot of training with different organizations. I've done a lot of, we'll say, self-teaching or self-learning as well, just through you know colleagues in the online space, diving into literature every single day, which maybe we can talk about what I do for that on a daily basis. And then I've helped out with a couple textbooks. So I'm a collaborating author on Pro Health Systems nutrition textbook. I helped fact check Simon Hill's The Proof is in the Plants best-selling book. So kind of involved all over the place at this point in the nutrition space.
Cool. Sounds good. And I think you've done like a certification with Dr. T. Colin Campbell.
Yeah,
That
the Cornell cert as
yeah,
well. Did that one 3, 4, maybe 5 years ago, something like that.
yeah. If you guys don't know, Colin Campbell is I love him. He's a great nutritionist, and I think he's a doctor as well. Um, and I like his work as well. Yeah. So today I want to talk about vegan health outcomes. I debate a lot of people that are non-vegan all the time, and they always bring up these these arguments against vegan nutrition. And I want to go through some of those main concerns and get your response to those things. So,
Okay.
but first, tell us about what you typically eat in a day, your meals, breakfast, lunch, dinner, just in a synopsis.
Yeah, I actually just made a video, kind of a day in the life, what I eat, and then showing how I hit all the nutrition targets with it. It's pretty simple. So for that day, which is pretty representative of a lot of days, it was just oatmeal for breakfast. I throw flax seeds, blueberries, um, some protein powder, sometimes not the full scoop, depending on how thick I want it to be. But all of that for breakfast, usually with a coffee or tea or something on the side. And then lunch, a pretty common one is a sandwich, whole wheat toast. I'll either use like a hummus or vegan mayo, or maybe even a barbecue sauce or something, depending on what I'm feeling. And then sriracha or smoked tofu, or sometimes I'll spice the tofu myself, depending on, again, what I'm feeling. And then just throw some veggies on there and some avocado on the other slice. And then might have a snack on some fruit, maybe a matcha latte, something like that. And then for dinner, one of my favorites is a lentil or chickpea, or in the case of the video I shared, it was actually a pea-based pasta with a tomato sauce, and I kind of mix in all the spices and herbs myself, and top it up with some vegetables.
Awesome, sounds good. I'm getting actually pretty hungry. Um, it sounds pretty similar to what I eat. I eat a lot of lentils, a lot of lentil soups, mushrooms. I love mushrooms. Yeah. So now, one of the first things that a lot of non-vegans will say is, well, protein, right? That's one of the first things they'll say, and I think we don't get enough protein for some reason. Now, to go a little bit deeper in this, the amino acid profiles is what we care about here, and there's a lot of concern as to whether or not they are, they're worse than animal based proteins in terms of plant based proteins, and they're not as digestible. So, you know, go ahead and elaborate on that.
Yeah, so there are typically three claims that are made. The first claim is that you can't get the same amount of protein, and that just depends on what you're eating. So if you replace meat with rice, well, then yeah, you're going to get less protein per calorie, less protein per gram. However you want to measure it, it's less. But if you replace, let's say, your typical like 80% lean beef with a like tofu, you get about the same amount of protein per calorie. You still need to eat a bit more volume to get the same amount, but it's much closer. Now, if you replace beef, even extra lean beef, with like textured vegetable protein or with seitan, you can get about the same amount of protein as even those extra lean cuts. So more protein than your typical meat. If we look at dairy, you replace whole milk with soy milk, you've increased your protein intake. You replace like a 1-2% with soy milk, it's about the same. And you replace uh, skim milk with a soy milk, and it's close to the same, slightly less, but it's comparable. And if we go on further to eggs, which is the other one, eggs compared to something like Just Egg or some kind of egg replacement, they're about the same. And if you replace eggs with tofu and make a tofu scramble, you actually get more protein. So it really just comes down to education around what you're replacing those meats with, because most meat eaters, carnivores excluded, are getting some of their protein from plants and some of their protein from animals. And all you're doing is replacing those animal sources with other plant sources. So it's not like you're filling your whole diet with just these high protein plant foods. They're just specific swaps that are occurring there, and the rest of the diet can remain roughly the same.
Right.
Well, no, sorry, I was just going to say, and then there's the two other claims, but
Okay.
yeah,
Go ahead.
anything to add
Yeah,
to that?
go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, yeah, no. So then the second claim is around amino acid profiles. So they will say that plant proteins are incomplete. That's a pretty common phrase that that gets thrown out there. And plant proteins, by the scientific definition, are not incomplete. An incomplete protein would be missing one of the 9 essential amino acids. So these are the amino acids or building blocks of protein that we need to eat in our diet. And every single plant contains every single amino acid or dietary amino acid. And so if you were to eat, let's say, a single plant food, let's say you only ate black beans or something, and you just barely skirted the minimum protein requirement for the day, you would probably you'd have a decent amount of most of the amino acids, but there might be one or two that fall below that cutoff, just because they contain all of the essential amino acids, but one or two of them might just be in a lower quantity than is typical in, say, animal products. So the fix there is just to eat more than one type of food or food group, which I think we all advocate for. So that's an easy fix. The other fix is just to eat more protein, which also is pretty easy to do. So the claim that plant proteins are incomplete is just false, because they contain all of the amino acids. It's just that they have different proportions of each. Funny enough, the one food or dietary supplement, however you want to think of it, that we consume, or many people consume, that is incomplete is actually collagen or its derivative gelatin. That is missing one of the essential amino acids called tryptophan, and it's an animal product, which is sort of ironic. But yeah, so that should hopefully put the amino acid thing to rest. And then the third claim that's made, and you did mention this, is around digestibility, that plant protein sources are less digestible, so you have to eat more to sort of compensate because you aren't absorbing all of it. And there's seems to be a huge misunderstanding on how digestibility is measured. So what I see most people claiming is that based on these protein digestibility scores, like one's called the PDCAS, or protein digestibility corrected amino acid score, or the DAS, called the digestible indispensable amino acid score. Based on those scores, plant proteins are maybe 20-30% less bioavailable compared to animal proteins. But there's a huge issue with looking at those scores. For one, both of them are typically measured in animal models. The PDCAS in rodents, the DAS in pigs. And there are exceptions to that, but those are the main animals that are used. We aren't rodents and we aren't pigs. Now, pigs are closer to us in their digestive tract, perhaps, but they still have different protein needs, and obviously they aren't identical to us. So that's one problem with translating that to humans. The second problem is that, especially with the DAS, which is done in pigs, they often use raw foods. So they'll use raw legumes, so raw beans, raw lentils, or raw grains, perhaps. And when you cook those foods, you increase the digestibility, and obviously we consume those foods cooked. So already they're going to be less digestible in that situation. There are a few studies where they cook them, and we can talk about those, but by and large, they're raw. The third issue that applies mostly to the one tested in rodents is that they measure digestion straight from the mouth all the way out the other end. So basically, they measure how much protein goes in and how much comes out the other end. But some of the bacteria in the lower intestine, or the large intestine, will chew up some of that protein, and so it's not a super accurate measure. That isn't as much of an issue with the Diaz that is measured in pigs typically, because they will insert a tube through the abdomen. Not very nice, but they will do that, and they'll remove the food at the end of the small intestine. But the biggest problem with these scoring systems, and this is the one that nobody seems to ever bring up when citing them, is that it's not just looking at digestibility. So when people claim that it's looking at digestibility, what they're essentially saying, or at least how most people would take that, is that if you consume this amount of protein, this is the percentage of it that you're actually going to absorb. But what those scores are actually doing is they look at all of the individual amino acids, and they'll see, let's say you take an amino acid that, or let's say you take a protein where one of the amino acids is only present in sort of like 50% of what you would need in a day, based or 50% of whatever they're comparing it to, like an egg or something. And let's say you absorb 80% of it. You would only get 40% of what you need in a day. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that protein would get a score of 40%. It's a little more complicated than that, but that's roughly it.
Hmm.
That doesn't mean that you're only absorbing 40% of the protein in there, because you could be absorbing 80% of all the protein, and most of the amino acids could be super high and you could be getting tons of them. But because that one amino acid falls short, you get docked a whole bunch.
Hmm.
And that can be very misleading, because we don't eat single foods. We eat a
Right.
combination of foods. If that food is low in X amino acid, but another food is very high in that amino acid, then it doesn't matter, because it's compensating. And so when you're eating a varied diet of grains, legumes, nuts and seeds, and so on, they complement each other, and you don't have to worry about it. So that is by far the biggest problem I see with these scoring systems and how they're typically cited. Now, we have a couple studies looking at the total protein digestibility in humans. And when you do that, at least when you compare high quality protein sources, it's a few percent difference maybe between animal and plant protein. And when you look at studies on even like cooked foods, and you're looking at the total protein digestibility in pig models, it's still, usually 80, 90 plus percent. So it's actually much, much, much higher, but these scoring systems are unfortunately biasing scores towards the animal protein sources.
Yeah, I didn't think about that. The fact that the ways they measure the protein digestibility is can be biased. Yeah. And then another thing, I think I was reading one of Michael Greger's. He linked a study where an older study that showed that the body stores and recirculates protein, kind of like
Mhm.
stores like up to 90 grams per day. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, I can't recall the exact numbers. So, I mean, sure,
Mhm.
for sake of argument, we'll say that the 90% or whatever is true. But yeah, we do recycle proteins all the time. We're always doing that. And that's another reason why these concerns over like complementing proteins and stuff isn't really that big of a concern, unless you're really falling short all the time. But still, we have dietary needs, so we need to still consume a certain amount of protein, and we have certain targets for each individual amino acid, because you're not just going to constantly recycle those amino acids forever. It diminishes
Right. Right.
over time. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, the moral of the story is to eat a diverse, varied diet, and you'll be fine as a vegan. There's no reason
Yeah,
to.
eat a diverse diet. Focus on protein-rich foods. I would throw that in there. So, focus on consuming legumes, tofu, seitan if you have access, those sorts of things as well. But yeah, it really doesn't have to be that hard when you do that. And actually, in my sort of day in the life sample I put out there on Instagram, actually it's on all the platforms, YouTube as well. I had like 170 grams of protein in the day. And sure, that included a protein powder that provided 30 grams, but you can take that out altogether. It's still 140 grams. So it's quite a lot.
Yeah. People don't realize how easy it is to get protein.
Hmm.
Um, Yep. So that's great. The next thing I want to talk about is vitamin A. Vitamin A in its original form isn't necessarily found in plant-based foods, and a lot of non-vegans will say, "Oh, look, see, you can't get vitamin A." But of course, beta carotene converts into A. However, a lot of people will say, "Well, there's a limit to this conversion in some people who have specific gene types." So please elaborate this, and is it a concern?
Yeah, so we do convert, yeah, pro vitamin A carotenoids like beta carotene from things like carrots, sweet potatoes. It's that kind of orangey color. I mean, it's in greens as well. You just don't see it because the green color covers it up. But we do convert that into vitamin A. And it's actually kind of a good thing because you can't get too much that way either. So with, a lot of people will say you just eat liver, but if you eat too much liver and get too much preformed vitamin A, you can actually get vitamin A toxicity. So you don't
Mm.
want to be doing that like crazy either. But with the beta carotene, yes, that conversion depends on certain enzymes, and yes, some people have lower activity of those enzymes. And because of that, they might convert less. But the thing is, it's so easy. We don't need very much. And so there are estimates out there, even very, very conservative estimates with low levels of conversion, suggesting that like a cup and a half of sweet potatoes in a day, if you excluded the rest of the diet, obviously you would still get vitamin A through other sources as well. But if all you had was a cup and a half of sweet potatoes, you would still convert enough.
Wow.
So it's not that much. And so it really doesn't have to be that hard. In fact, there are some case studies of people who had these mutations where they weren't converting very well, and there still wasn't any clear sign of vitamin A deficiency. Now, there is one case report that I'm aware of someone who has a very, very rare genetic mutation. Now, when people talk about this vitamin A conversion thing, they make it sound like it's a lot of people. But there's only one case that I've seen, period, in the literature where conversion might be too low to make it viable. It might be possible if you're really hammering in the beta carotene and really focusing on it. But in that one super rare case, it's as simple as just taking a supplement. Potentially, and with vitamin A, depending on dosing and how much you need, it's probably best to do that under some supervision, medical supervision. But yeah, it's a simple solution even in those incredibly rare cases.
Yeah, a lot of like you said, a lot of non-vegans will make it such a big thing. Oh, you can't get vitamin A as a vegan. It's actually very easy. Just eat your, orange vegetables, yellows, even a lot of
Yeah.
greeny leafy vegetables will have it. Great. And then the next thing is omega threes, DHA. A lot of people will say, well, how am I going to get that DHA, which is a specific lipid molecule, I believe, that is commonly found more in meat and things, but it's rare in plants. How can vegans ensure that they're getting enough DHA?
Well, I would correct you in saying it's found in meat. Like, yes, it's found in meat, but it's not very rich in
Right.
meat.
Right.
It's more so fish, typically, in seafood.
Okay.
But yeah, so we consume or we can get short chain omega-3 fats like alpha linolenic acid or ALA from many plant foods. Flax seeds, walnuts, chia seeds, soy is typically a good source. Certain oils are good sources. And we convert some of that into EPA and then DHA, both of those being the long chain omega-3s that you would typically get from, say, fish, if you were eating fish. The concerns are that we don't convert enough, and it is true that conversion to especially DHA is pretty minimal. There are certain things that may like ramp up conversion a bit or decrease conversion, and this is an area of debate. I would say in the nutrition literature around like, is there benefit to supplementing? Thus far, if I'm to just do a really brief kind of say broad overview without getting into too much of the nitty gritty, in people with some cardiovascular risk factors, high triglycerides being one, or other, or potentially just at risk of cardiovascular disease, there may be benefit to supplementing these omega 3s and reducing risk of future cardiovascular events. And specifically in cases of high triglycerides, there is actually a prescription version that's a very high dose, EPA in particular, that is given. And for people with, say, early signs of cognitive decline, early signs of dementia, there might be benefits to supplementing, and particularly probably the DHA more so than the EPA. But in healthy individuals, in my opinion, there just isn't really strong, compelling evidence that there is benefit. That doesn't mean that there isn't benefit. It could be small, maybe follow ups haven't been long enough. And we don't really have good data on vegan populations who are consuming basically no EPA or DHA. So, as a precautionary measure, I can understand people wanting to supplement EPA and DHA, but we can do that from algae sources. You don't need fish for that. I would still stop short of saying it's an absolute necessity for people because I don't think the data is strong enough. And if there is a benefit, I do suspect it's a pretty modest benefit because we haven't really picked up on it too much in healthy populations. But Yeah, I think it's a reasonable precautionary measure if someone wanted to take that, and obviously could afford the supplementation because it's generally a more of an expensive one. But we do convert ALA to EPA and DHA. Vegans do still have DHA in their blood when measured. It's not like we have zero. It just tends to be somewhat less than we see in other populations. Oh, and
Yeah.
I should say supplements during pregnancy and breastfeeding are where it's more indicated. I'd say we have stronger data. So during that time period, I definitely suggest people supplement.
Yeah. And a lot of times, when it comes to omega threes, people say, "Well, it's only in certain foods, or certain oils or things." But aren't omega threes found in like fruits, like in most
Very small amounts.
fruits?
Yeah,
Small
yeah.
amounts. Yeah.
So you have to think about the fat content. So if you're taking a
Mm,
food that's super low in fat, yeah, a portion of that fat is probably going to be this ALA.
right.
But I mean, if there's such little fat to begin with, it's going to be a pretty small amount.
Right. So avocados probably have a bit.
Might have some, but they're more rich in monounsaturated fats. So it's a different kind of fat.
Okay, gotcha.
They will have some, yes, but no, I wouldn't say that they have a ton.
But best sources are like flax seeds, like
Yeah,
nut
flax
seeds.
seeds, walnuts, hemp seeds, chia seeds are pretty good. Canola oil, even though that gets a lot of flack, is a good source, and soy is a pretty decent source.
Olive oil, is that it's pretty good, right?
Olive oil is pretty low because it's more monounsaturated, like the avocado as well. It still has some, again, like
Right.
I've said, but not super rich.
Okay, cool. The next question, vitamin D. I know you're in BC, but here in Florida, I'm in Florida right now, and then we
Yeah.
typically get a lot of sun, especially in the
Yeah.
summer. So I'm usually out there in the sun. That's how we get vitamin D a lot of the times. But a lot of people up north, where there isn't much sun, people understand that vitamin D is kind of not present in many vegan foods. So how do we get vitamin D as vegans?
Yeah, so like you said, I mean, if you're in Florida and you're out in the sun all the time, probably not a concern at all. But over here in BC, actually in Canada in general, it is pretty common to have low serum levels. Again, there's some debate around where the actual cutoffs for value should be. There seems to be an argument for lower cutoffs now. So maybe if you fall a little bit below, it's not a big problem. But still, as a precautionary measure, it's not a bad idea to supplement or to consume some fortified foods with vitamin D. So a lot of the plant milks nowadays will be fortified with vitamin D. So it's just about having some sort of reliable, consistent source. I would not rely on dietary sources outside of fortified sources for that. I know some will argue that like if you put mushrooms out in the sun for a while, they'll make some vitamin D. Like, yeah, again, that's going to be for certain portions of the year. How much they produce is variable. I would
Mm,
not rely on that.
yeah, for sure. Um, and this ties in, I think, to the next question here about bone health. Um, a lot of people will say, well, as a vegan, your bones are weak because there has been a couple studies out there showing that osteoporosis is perhaps more present in vegans versus
Mm.
meat eaters. Can you dispel some of these myths and maybe elaborate on vegan bone health?
Yeah, there's really one study that sort of blew up and promoted that idea, and that was the Epic Oxford study where they did find that vegans and I believe vegetarians as a whole, I'd have to double check, had a higher risk of fracture compared to meat eaters. But there were a few issues with that. So for one, they didn't even consider vitamin D intake or status, and a previous study from the same cohort suggested that vegans did have lower vitamin D status, so maybe that plays a role. Second, they had lower calcium intake. Again, could play a role. They had lower protein intake. Could also play a role. But when those factors were accounted for, there was still a higher risk of fracture. And what seems to be driving that risk in that study was possibly lower body weight. So that is a risk factor, especially if you fall into the category of what would be considered underweight. That's where risk really goes up. And when you look at people with sort of, we'll say mid-range BMI, like mid-healthy range body mass index or higher, there was not a significant increase in risk in vegans. But if you looked at the lower BMIs, there was. And based on the sort of distribution of BMIs amongst the vegans versus, say, the meat eaters, the vegans had far more people that could have fallen into the underweight category or even like
Mm,
substantially underweight category. And the way that the study accounted for that is they lumped all of the people who would be quote unquote underweight or have a BMI below 18 and a half. They lump them all into one group. Now, if you have a whole bunch of vegans and a lot of them are like substantially underweight versus maybe a handful of more than that, but we'll say like a handful of non-vegetarians or omnivores who are slightly underweight, well, then you're comparing pretty potentially significant differences in fracture risk. So
Mhm.
that likely explains those results because, again, at the more kind of middle of the healthy range and above, we didn't see a higher fracture risk. Then a second study came out. It was either the same year or the year after from the Adventist Health Study too. And in that one, they found that vegan women specifically were at higher risk of hip fracture. And I should note that with the other study, it was women in particular as well, not the men. So vegan women in the Adventist Health Study 2 were at higher risk of hip fracture. But when you only looked at people who supplemented calcium and vitamin D, there was no significant increase in risk compared to meat eaters. And so in that case, I mean, there's a couple things that we can take away from those two studies. One, obviously you want to be at a healthy body weight. And two, you want to make sure you have a consistent source of both vitamin D and calcium and you're meeting your needs. And when you do that, it doesn't seem to really be a concern.
Exactly. And calcium, good sources of that. Tofu isn't.
Tofu can be a pretty good source. Calcium set tofu, especially, very good source. That's essentially fortified in a way because the calcium is used in the process of making it. Fortified plant milks, probably my favorite, most convenient source. So fortified like soy, almond, oat, whatever you prefer. And that's about 300 cups or 300 milligrams per cup in most cases. So that's about a third of your daily needs in a single cup. Really, really easy. And then getting about half to 2/3 of your diet through or your calcium through diet is pretty easy outside of fortified foods.
Yeah, you also got like I think like oranges, fruits have calcium, leafy greens as well, right?
Almonds, I should mention, almonds are decent for nuts. Tahini is a good one as well. People use that.
Cool. Thank you. And then the next question is about kind of ties in with it's about soy and testosterone, right? A lot of
Okay.
they'll call us right, soy boys, whatever. Um, but I want to dispel some of those myths about the notion that testosterone is lower in vegans because of soy consumption. So go ahead, elaborate on that, please, if you
Yeah.
can.
These myths really stem from a couple places. For one, there's some studies on rodents where they're given just ridiculously high doses of these soy phytoestrogens. So actually, I should back up even further. Soy contains these compounds called isoflavones, which have some structural similarities to estrogen. They aren't the same. They look, if you were to look up pictures, I don't know if you can put some up on the screen or something, but they look somewhat similar in certain ways, but they're clearly different. But because they have some structural similarities, they can bind to some of the same receptors that our own estrogen does. But there are some differences. So, for one, they prefer to bind to receptors that in breast tissue, for example, have anti estrogenic effects, not pro estrogenic. So, it's actually the
Mhm.
opposite. In bone tissue, they bind to receptors that have pro-estrogenic effects, which is a good thing. That's good for bone health. And so it has different effects in different parts of the body and not necessarily estrogenic effects, so to speak. Now, there were a couple case studies of a couple of men who were having, I can't recall the exact numbers. It was like 14 in one case and 20 servings in another case, like per day. So we're talking like a soy predominant diet, basically almost a soy only diet, really. You're just ridiculous. One of them
Soy
did
boys.
experience some erectile dysfunction. One of them experienced some breast tissue growth, but it's not even 100% clear that it was due to the soy. It could have been due to a number of things because there was no control here. They had a very monotonous diet. Maybe that's a part of the problem, not necessarily the soy per se. A number of possible explanations. But even if we grant that it was soy, like that's a ridiculous amount. Nobody's recommending that. Now we have dozens of randomized controlled trials where they'll take a bunch of people, and we have studies on men and women, where you take a bunch of people, you split them in half randomly, half get soy, half get a non-soy control, and you measure their hormone levels, and in some cases assess things that are say related to hormone health. So in women, that might be like menstrual cycle length and things like that, and in men, it might be erectile function or other markers, and you see no significant effects on estrogen or testosterone across the board. So, or at least no clinically significant effects in either direction. So, There really is no good reason to be fearing soy in this case. And what's also interesting is that soy is an excellent protein source, and we have a number of trials comparing soy to even whey protein for muscle and strength gains,
Mm.
and promotes about the same sort of gains as well. So, yeah, it's just a myth that never seems to go away.
Well, that's all they got. Another thing they say is, in these plant defense chemicals, right? They'll say, well,
Mhm.
these plants are trying to defend themselves to spewing all these chemicals out, the lectins and oxalates. Um, are they a concern? Should vegans be worried about these lectins and oxalates, these so-called
Yeah,
anti-nutrients?
yeah. Um, Well, actually, I did a very lengthy debate with a prominent carnivore on this topic, Anthony Chafee. So feel free to watch that on my YouTube if you really want to go down the rabbit hole. Yeah, look, if plants are toxic, as they say, then why are they in almost every study done to date, they are associated with better outcomes. So if they were so toxic, we should see people eating more plants actually doing worse, having higher risk of premature death, higher risk of cardiovascular disease, cancers, et cetera. But we see the opposite. So
Right.
right there, that should raise some eyebrows. Now to get into the specifics, things like lectins, for example, they're destroyed when we cook. So if you're cooking beans in particular, especially kidney beans, are the ones that contain lectins that could potentially be toxic. When you cook them, you destroy those lectins. So who cares? Because we always cook those foods. In other foods, like say tomatoes, there are different types of lectins, and they don't have that same property. They aren't necessarily
Mm.
toxic, and actually, there's preclinical data suggesting that they could have anti-cancer properties. That's not me saying that they are going to cure cancer, but I'm just saying like you could speculate in the opposite direction that they would have these positive effects. So, yeah, the lectin stuff is just nonsense. For oxalates, there's a nugget of truth. If you're somebody who's predisposed to kidney stones and you have tons of oxalates, these would be things from foods like spinach, beets, and chard being some of the main sources. If you're having tons of those foods and you're predisposed to kidney stones, that might increase kidney stone risk. But if you make sure you're getting enough calcium, which we've already talked about, which helps bind up the oxalates, that can reduce your risk of kidney stones. And if you uh, obviously if you are at risk, you just limit those specifically like very high oxalate foods like the spinach, the chard, the beets, etc. And that should also help reduce the risk. But generally speaking, and in studies that we have on larger populations, when we consider people who are getting enough calcium, we don't see an increase in risk in kidney stones because, again, the calcium helps bind up those oxalates. Either way, I mean, if you are someone who deals with kidney stones, I'm sure I'm sure you have a nephrologist who's a kidney specialist for those of you wondering, and you can obviously speak with them about your particular case, any modifications that need to be made to diet, and usually they'll suggest something similar.
Fantastic. Thank you. Um, the next thing, and this is more going to be more close to you in terms of your paper that recently came out. Um, a lot of people say, well, you're eating so much processed plant foods, Impossible Burgers and all these sausages, these plant-based sausages. That's terrible. That's way worse than meat. And recently, you've done a paper on this, so please elaborate. Are processed plant-based alternatives better or worse than meat itself, than conventional meat?
Yeah, for those wondering, we have a paper out in the Canadian Journal of Cardiology, and it's been featured all over the place, Men's Health and stuff. It's been really cool seeing it take off like that. And we looked at plant-based meat alternatives and cardiovascular risk in particular. And there were a few things to note. So when we look at studies comparing the nutritional composition, so like the fiber, saturated fat, et cetera, we found that the plant-based meats tended to have more fiber, less saturated fat, less cholesterol, more polyunsaturated fats, which are the heart healthy ones. Um, and the protein and sodium content were variable. So in some comparisons, the plant-based meats had more sodium or less protein, and other studies they might have the opposite, or it depends on what sort of products you're comparing. But overall, on average, we see a more heart healthy pattern to their nutritional profiles. We then looked at randomized controlled trials in which plant based meats were pitted against animal based meats. And this includes some studies where they took things like Beyond Meat and replaced them or compared them specifically to like organic and grass fed meat products too. So,
Mm.
not that I think that makes a big difference, but obviously I know there are some people who would say that's better. And Pretty much across the board, we saw improvements in cardiovascular risk factors like reductions in LDL cholesterol. We did not see rises in blood pressure despite them using high sodium options a lot of the time. And there were a couple studies suggesting like a reduction in body weight or waist circumference as well. So actually aiding potentially with a bit of fat loss, which is pretty positive, especially given that a lot of these studies were pretty short term, and it's a pretty simple swap of just replacing your meat with a plant-based meat. So the data suggests that there's actually positive outcomes from replacing meat with plant-based meat alternatives, not necessarily negative outcomes. Now, people might say, well, they're heavily processed. Clearly, that makes them bad for you. But I would argue that just because something is processed doesn't necessarily make it, less healthy. In fact, in some ways, it could be more healthy. Protein powder, heavily processed, but it's an excellent source of protein. And a recent meta analysis suggests it can improve blood pressure, blood sugar, a number of other markers. That would be one example. Other ones are things like whole wheat bread, for example, or whole wheat breakfast cereals, or whole grain breakfast cereals, I should say. Those are typically associated with really good health outcomes. On the flip side, other processed foods that are associated with poor outcomes consistently are sugary drinks and processed meats, funny enough, which is, speaking of the meat topic. So, not all processed foods are created equal. And so, we shouldn't consider something harmful simply because it's processed, because labeling something as ultra processed based on the normal sort of classification system that's used has nothing to do with its health value. It's solely based on the types and number of ingredients that's in the product.
Cool. Fantastic. And this is another good ties into the next question here. Good. Um, how does red meat? There's different pathways that red meat can increase cancer risk. And is there a difference between, like you said, organic meat and regular or conventional meat? Is there a difference, and how does red meat cause and increase the risk of cancer?
So whether there's a difference, I don't see why there would be any clear sort of difference, because the components of red meat that we suspect lead to an increase in cancer risk, especially colorectal cancer risk, they're inherent to the meat. It's things like heme iron, for example, which is in the meat. You're not getting rid of that by choosing organic. And there's a number of potential processes, largely having to do with like very oxidative products, like heme iron can lead to, for example. And this can damage DNA, lead to tumor formation and growth of those cells, and ultimately cancer.
Mm.
And that's the we'll say simple version of what happens with tumor growth in basically any part of the body. Um, and so, yeah, I would say that there's not really a good reason to suspect a difference by choosing those products, nor is there good reason to suspect that just because you eat a lot of fruits and veggies that you're completely mitigating the risks of, say, meat on colorectal cancer,
Mm.
like some people claim, but usually based on studies that didn't look specifically at colorectal cancer and didn't look at very much meat intake. So that's actually another really important take home is, if you're citing the study, the Alberta project, or whatever it was called, that I know Lane Norton cites a lot, high meat intake was less than a serving a day. It was like 5 servings a week, roughly. It's not a lot. Where we see colorectal cancer risk increase consistently is above a serving a day. So that seems to be sort of the threshold, or around the threshold for that. And second, they lumped a whole bunch of different cancers together into one pot. And overall, we didn't see an increase in risk when people ate a lot of fruits and veggies, but it's totally possible that the meat still increased risk of some cancers, but then the veggies and fruits reduce the risk of others, making it look neutral. What I would like to see is a similar study specifically looking at colorectal cancer, which is probably the one that is most strongly linked to. And so we can't rule that out. And I'd say, based on the overwhelming balance of evidence, yeah, red meat increases the risk of colorectal cancer.
Fantastic. Now you mentioned heme iron, and a lot of carnivores or meat eaters will say, well, vegans aren't getting enough heme iron, and the reason why they say it is because it's more bioavailable, and they act as if that's always, correlated to good health outcomes. So is heme iron required for our consumption? Is it good? Is it bad? And how is it bad?
So for one, it's not required. And as far as bioavailability, so yeah, heme iron has a very consistent bioavailability. Excuse me if I don't remember the exact numbers. It's around like 25, 30%, if I recall. roughly, where that's about how much of the heme iron you'll absorb out of what you consume. With non-heme iron, which is the only type that we'll see in plant foods, it's highly variable. It could be as low as single digits from some foods or in certain circumstances, and it could be as high as kind of mid 20s on the other flip side. So it could be similar to heme iron even. And some factors that influence that is one, if you are low in iron. So if your iron status is low, your body ramps up absorption. So you absorb more.
Mm.
So it's regulated, right? If you have enough, you aren't going to absorb as much. Second is there are certain things that boost absorption. So like vitamin C is an excellent absorption booster. So if your status is low and you're consuming iron with vitamin C, you absorb a lot more and that percentage goes up. On the flip side, certain things might reduce absorption, like coffee or tea, although there's some debate if you have it regularly, it might not affect iron absorption too much, but at least in some of the studies we have, that might negatively impact absorption. So um, it's good in the sense that it's regulated because too much iron isn't good either. However, on average, yeah, heme iron will be absorbed to a greater degree. And in cases where iron deficiency is a problem, obviously supplements can be considered. That's one option. And supplements are going to be at much, much higher doses than you're ever going to get from meat, really, unless you're eating a very meat heavy, like carnivorous sort of diet. You're not going to touch that amount of iron. Those would be like ultimately the takeaways there. And in fact, meat eaters struggle with iron deficiency. It's the number one
Mm.
nutrient deficiency in the world. Meat eating women, in particular, very consistently have iron deficiency,
Mm.
just like vegan women do. It's not necessarily a huge difference. And studies comparing iron status between vegans and meat eaters tend to not really see a substantial difference in risk of iron deficiency. It's just a problem, period.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Um, and yeah, the next question here is about the carnivore diet. Now, it's been a fad recently, and I see it dying down. Right, a lot of
Hmm.
those influencers are straying away from it.
Yeah.
Um, but I want to talk about the carnivore diet, the long term risks of that. Are there any long term studies on the carnivore diet?
There's certainly no like high quality modern studies on a carnivore diet.
Mhm.
There's some studies that carnivores will cite as evidence for a carnivore diet, even though the groups of people they're talking about weren't eating a carnivore diet. They'll be perhaps um, like older tribes that ate a meat heavy diet, but we have very little data on their like diet and lifestyle practices, very little data on long term health outcomes. Like I would say the data is incredibly limited, and we have basically nothing on long term health outcomes at this point. But we
Right.
can speculate based on what we know about meat intake and what we know about plant intake. Like we know fruits and veggies are beneficial, they're removing those. And we know that red meat, especially above that, say, serving a day or so, increases risk of things like colorectal cancer and cardiovascular disease. And they're going way above that one a week or
Mhm.
one a day, sorry.
Right. Okay. Now, and then a lot of meat eaters will try to argue for the carnivore diet by saying, or at least a meat-based diet by saying, well, meat played a role in our brain development when we evolved. And is there any actual evidence that meat in particular helped our brains grow throughout evolution, or is that just nonsense?
So I think, and I'm not an anthropologist by any means. I don't know if there's things that I'm missing here, but my understanding is that there are a number of reasons for our brain development, and that largely being energy availability. So it's not just meat, but the ability to cook, grains perhaps, and other things as well. Is the ability to extract more energy from food with less effort. And so that is a big, big part of what led to our development. And there are now a number of studies suggesting that around the same times that these carnivores claim we were eating carnivorous diets, we're actually eating a lot of plants. The difference is a lot of plant matter doesn't stick around. It's not going to be fossilized the same way that like animal remains will be. And so until more recently, we haven't really been able to dive deep into what humans are eating, but there have been more advanced techniques now to sort of I know some of it has to do with like dentition and
Mhm.
again, not an anthropologist, can't
Well,
don't know all the
I
individual
think they will
methods.
like take a look at like markings on teeth, and
Yeah,
they'll look at, I don't know like they'll look at individual molecules of stuff,
yeah,
and it's really incredible what they do. But
yeah.
you're making a great point here that the techniques are different today than they were 30 years ago. So
Mhm.
our understanding of our evolution has changed.
Yeah, there was one paper, what was it, last year, suggesting that like lentils or something, or some type of like something similar to lentils anyway, in that sort of family, was a mainstay in certain parts of the world. And that's actually the other thing, is that our diets would have differed around the world depending on what's available, climate, all sorts of factors. So claiming that we ate one type of diet, period, is just nonsense.
Exactly. Um,
Not that it matters. I'm just gonna be
yeah,
clear. Yeah,
yeah.
not that it matters what we ate back then.
Now I know that the vegan diet, a lot of great nutritionists and doctors have done studies on like reversal of heart disease. I think Caldwell is his name. Uh, I forgot. But they've also recently done a study on Alzheimer's reversal. Have you seen that study? And can you talk about that?
Yeah, so there's a couple things. For one, I wouldn't say that we have good evidence of reversal of atherosclerosis. In fact,
Mhm.
there's good interview. I've gotten some sneak peeks around what's said in there, um, from Nutrition Made Simple on YouTube, and he actually interviewed Caldwell Esselstyn recently. He's already put up a little clip, I think a 10-15 minute clip of it. And in that, he points out some really valid points right to Caldwell Esselstyn, and he actually acknowledges them, that it looks like with some of the reversal claims, not just from his paper, but Dean Ornish's as well, that it might not be necessarily the plaque that was getting smaller, but that the artery had dilated, making the plaque
Mhm.
relatively smaller.
Mm.
And so there, at the end of the day, whether or not it's reversed doesn't matter. What ultimately matters is, does it reduce your risk of having a heart attack? Because you can have cases where plaque shrinks, but you have a higher risk, for example, or vice versa. You can have cases where plaque calcifies, so it hardens, and usually calcified plaque is a bad sign, but it actually reduces risk, especially if it's
Mm.
due to like medication. So I want to sort of step away from this sort of obsession with the reversal side, and focus more on, not saying that you were, but then
Yeah.
focus more on like the actual outcomes, because that's what's important. And with the Alzheimer's study, I wouldn't say that we saw any good evidence of reversal, so to speak, of Alzheimer's. At, maybe there was a bit of a reduction in progression, sure.
Mhm.
Progressing slower, and we've seen that with a number of different like dietary interventions, lifestyle interventions. There are a number of things that can help slow the progression, um, and a healthy lifestyle intervention is a one way to do that. The other thing I will say that nobody talked about with that study, and I didn't see any of, even when the authors of the study were on like media outlets talking about it, is they talked about it like it was a diet intervention. It wasn't just a diet intervention. There was exercise, there were social groups, and the list of supplements was ridiculous. It was like 20 supplements. That might be an exaggeration, but it had to have been well over 10 or well over a dozen supplements, probably close to 20, that they were on, all sorts that might have some limited evidence to be used in that case. And so I would not pin it on the diet.
Yeah. So in other
That
words,
said, yeah.
So in other words, the test subjects that were purported to be the ones who had lower rates of or lower progression of that disease, they were on supplements that could have played a role in
There
decreasing it.
a ton of supplements and made more lifestyle changes than just diet.
Okay.
So I just want that to be super, super clear. It's been a minute since I've looked at the paper, so I can't remember like specific values or what measurements were done. But I just know that there was a lot more going on,
Mhm.
and there wasn't really, from my memory, convincing evidence of reversal of the Alzheimer's, but possibly like a slowed progression, and
Yeah.
that's reasonable.
Yeah. The reversal was an asterisk. I think
Yeah,
part
yeah.
they knew that it wasn't going to be good evidence, but they just questioned it. Yeah. So the next question, and I think we're almost done, about 10 minutes. Reducing. There's a recent another recent study about reducing biological age, and a lot of people on X or Twitter, where I prefer to call it Twitter. A lot of people were very going crazy about the study. So I haven't seen the study at all, but have you seen the reduction of biological age study?
Yeah,
Can
so
you
have you seen the Netflix documentary on the twins study?
No.
The docuseries? Okay, anyways, it was a big thing, like, I think it was around New Year's or just after New Year's. It's the same study. So,
Oh,
they released the initial findings from that study, around the end of last year, I wanna say, and they looked at cardiovascular risk in that one. So they're looking at, like, LDL cholesterol and some other markers and found that, when a group of twins, there were 22 or 21 of them, I think, groups of twins, when they were split in half, one twin put on a vegan diet, one on an omnivorous diet, both designed to be healthy diets, though, so not like a junk food omnivorous versus a healthier vegan. But when they did that, they found that cardiovascular risk factors improved more on the vegan diet. Now, they followed that up with another publication, the same people from the same study, just other measurements that were done in that study, looking at markers of biological age. So we have, like, obviously our DNA is sort of set in stone, but we can, in, I guess the simplest way to explain it is we can turn on and off certain genes through our environment, our diet, a number of different ways, and with aging. And we sort of add these little tags to those genes that turn them on or off. And so we can actually look at the DNA and see where those tags are and how many there are, and that can be a sign of aging because as you age, there are certain changes or patterns that occur.
mm,
And so they found that when the twins were put on the vegan diet for, I believe it was 8 weeks, they actually saw a reduction in their biological age, which would be their age based on those markers. And that is typically associated with better long term health outcomes, so lower risk of things like premature death, for example. So that's a really good sign. It doesn't mean that they that it's a guarantee that they would have better outcomes long term, but that is strongly associated with better outcomes. So it could mean that. So I think there's a little bit of like hesitation we can have, or a little bit of caution we can exercise around just citing it and saying that it like reverses aging or something crazy like that. But it's a positive step in that direction, and it helps build our understanding because the effective diet on these markers of biological aging, that's pretty young, like as far as research goes. We don't know a ton yet, and it's a growing field. So this will just be sort of a stepping stone in that literature, and they say as much in the paper. Of course, that's not what the headlines grab. So, but either way, it's a good finding. It's a great finding. The
mhm.
funniest thing I will mention really quick is there was a carnivore account on Twitter that posted the headline of saying vegan diet reduces biological age and said no surprises with a laughing emoji. So this carnivore did not understand
Yeah,
it because they
yeah.
thought it was a bad thing when actually it was a very good thing,
Yeah, I
which is
saw
just
that.
further evidence that some of them don't read what they talk about.
Yeah, that's hilarious. Yeah, so for those of you who don't know, biological age just means like you were saying, the markers of your like in your DNA that tell you how your bodily functions are performing. Not your chronological age, which is the number you're like, I'm
Yeah.
29.
Yeah,
That's my
it's
chronological.
like it's like that saying of I'm 50, but I'm like a 20-year-old, or something. Like I feel like I'm 20 or something. Like that'd be a better way to think about it. It's like, yeah, your number obviously doesn't change, your age doesn't change, but you're inside, you're healthier.
Yeah. What do you think? I'm always on Twitter looking at this. I know he comes up on my feed. This guy, this billionaire guy, that's like,
Brian Johnson.
super supplemented. Yeah, super supplemented. He has everything he has just to reduce his biological age as much as he can. What do you think about that guy?
I mean, look, I don't think it's really gonna provide us with much information around aging.
Mm,
It's one person. There's not a lot we can glean from that. I think it's interesting. Hey, if you have all the resources in the world, why not? I guess. But at the same time, you don't necessarily know if all these things are um, going to be doing good for you. You don't know if they will be harmful. You don't know necessarily about all the interactions, because I know, like you said, he's taking a lot of different things, and I'm sure most of those have not been studied for interactions with the other. And
right.
that's one problem, is that you might have some interactions that lead to negative outcomes that you aren't aware of. So I would caution anyone from just jumping on his protocol. I actually got an email from his group about like becoming an affiliate with their program or something like that. It's funny, but no, I didn't do it, but I just thought that was funny. But yeah, no, I would caution anyone from just like jumping on board with that. But I mean, it's interesting to follow. I'm curious to see what comes of it. I guess later on we'll know in the decades to come probably. But I would not take much from it, and I certainly wouldn't model my own behaviors after it or after him.
For sure. Yeah. All right, Matt. Anything else you wanted to add before we go?
No, I think that's about it. Did we get through all the questions? Oh, we did. That's wild.
Yeah, we got it through all the questions
That's wild.
just in time. Yeah. So for those of you who don't know, Matt is on he's on Twitter, he's on YouTube. Go check him out. You can go ahead and plug your information.
Yeah, and I also say I'm most active on Instagram, but yeah, I'm on all those
Instagram.
platforms. I also have a practice out in Vancouver, BC, and if you are in BC for any reason and you want to book a consultation, go over your diet, or you're dealing with anything that you want to work on, you can reach out to me or book through drmatthewnagra.com, where the booking link is there in the top corner. But otherwise, I think that's about it.
Cool. Thank you so much for being here. It's been an honor talking to you and taking time out of your day. I know you're busy. I know you're pretty busy. Really appreciate that. So thanks again. And hopefully one day in the future, we'll talk again on something else.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Matt. See you later. And bye, everybody. Thanks for watching. See you next time.